Welcome back, everyone. And now what is the fourth session today for the inaugural CEDA's Public Interest Technology Digital Forum, where the focus of this session will be on the scientist and technologist's perspective. This will lead on from what else we've heard this morning, with Hilary talking to the role of trust and governance in technology and the structures required to achieve this. Michelle on the other keynote, broadly on trust and digital infrastructure, which you would have seen led to further counterpoints to this, as well as a discussion on putting humans at the centre of technology and through this empowering them in the process. My name's Simon Goodrich. I'll be the moderator for this session today. Where really what we're looking at is now seeking to get, a scientist and research perspective in the discussions of public interest in technology. Those in academia and research institutions are typically looking beyond the challenges and opportunities we see right now. So in this session, we'll be introduced to some of the broader themes we should be considering in the decade ahead and what processes we should be putting in place now to be prepared for this. We're joined by Dr. Caitlin Curtis, who is a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland. Her work explores how we can responsibly deploy emerging biotechnology and AI-driven technologies, and she's particularly interested in the privacy issues surrounding digital DNA data. And we're also joined by Dr. Justine Lacey, who leads CSIRO's Responsible Innovation Future Science Platform, a research program examining the interface between science, technology, innovation, and the associated ethical, social, and legal consequences of new and disruptive science and technologies. In terms of format for this session, Caitlin will be starting us first. That will be joined by Justine. There's an opportunity to ask questions through the channel. Just as it's been with other sessions, we'll be running a poll, and that poll can be found at ceda.pigeonhole.at with the password of PIT 2020. And the specific question that we're seeking to ask ourselves within this session is, do you believe technologists are responsible for what they build? So hopefully you can get in there and talk to that poll. After the Q&A, we'll go through that. And then finally, I'll be passing back over to Melinda, CEO of CEDA, to be closing out that first day. So I'll now use this as a jumping off point to introduce Caitlin, who'll be presenting some of her recent work in this session. Thank you.
Hi there. Let me just, can you see my slides okay? I think. I'm Caitlin. I'm really happy to be here, be part of this conversation. I'm a researcher at the University of Queensland, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of our recent work in artificial intelligence and trust. But my background is in science. I'm a population geneticist, and in the last couple of years, I've been focusing on some of the ethical, legal, and social aspects of genomics technologies. And one thing that's really struck me through all this work is the sort of gap from a technical perspective in where our capabilities are and where the law and the public understanding is. So I'll just start off by talking really briefly about this nationwide survey that we've conducted with KPMG, looking at trust in artificial intelligence. And this was a collaborative piece with Nicole Gillespie and Steve Lockie from the University of Queensland, and Ali Akbari, Rosanna Bianchi, James Mavitt, and Rita Fentner van Vlissingen from KPMG. Just going to present quickly a few of our findings that I think are really relevant to the discussion that we're having. One of the things that I think is really important when we're talking about emerging technology and thinking about public interest technology is what's the public understanding and awareness of these things, and how can we bring the public along? So in our survey of trust in artificial intelligence, people reported really having a low awareness of artificial intelligence. And you can see that here. 61% of the respondents really felt like they had a low understanding about what artificial intelligence is, and they didn't really feel informed about where it's used and how it's used. And about half of them, 51% only, reported that they'd heard or read or seen anything about artificial intelligence in the past year. In another question, we gave people a list of common technologies that use artificial intelligence, and you can see that here. And that includes a lot of things that people probably interact with really regularly. things like accommodation sharing apps, ride sharing apps, email filters. And we asked them first if they use the technology, and you can see that in the light blue. And then we asked them if they were aware or unaware that the technology had artificial intelligence. So you can see the percent of people unaware in the dark blue. And so if you look at the accommodation sharing apps, for example, over 70% of people were unaware that accommodation sharing apps use artificial intelligence. I think for me, the bigger picture here is that the technology is moving really quickly, and people are having a hard time keeping up. And even in things that they're using every day, like email and social media, they're not necessarily aware of some of these things that are underpinning it, like artificial intelligence. Thinking about the safety and regulation of artificial intelligence, almost half of the respondents did not agree that the current laws and regulations are sufficient, that they felt, to make AI safe. So what does that mean? Looking at the question at the bottom, I feel the current rules and regulations are sufficient to control AI. About 47% of the people disagreed with that statement. And perceptions and definitions are really important when we're talking about artificial intelligence. Even defining what it is, there seem to be cases where we're not agreeing on what it is at all. And in particular, policymakers may be talking about one thing where developers may be talking about another. This is some research that was done by Oxford, Washington, and Harvard. And I think it's really interesting because the definitions are quite different. So for example, the developers tend to be focusing in on the technical functionality, which is more inclusive of technologies that are in use today when they're talking about AI, whereas regulators seem to be thinking of it in more of human terms, which tends to include these hypothetical future technologies. So in some senses, the developers and the policymakers seem to be talking about slightly different things. And what this can mean is that the ethical and regulatory efforts may overemphasize concern about future technologies at the expense of issues that are around existing technologies. I think this is a really important point for this kind of a conversation, because if we're going to try to have conversations around what's in the public interest, we need to have these nuanced conversations where everybody needs to be able to be talking about the same thing. And with people, the technology moving quickly and people sort of struggling to keep up, one thing that comes up is different people view governance issues in different ways. And this is some research, again, done by Oxford, a survey of 2,000 people in the United States. And I think an interesting point here is what they found were that people with computer science and engineering degrees tended to rate the governance challenges with artificial intelligence as being less important than the overall public. And I think that underscores something that we all already know and are all trying to work to be doing, but we need to be engaging outside of just the developer community and the scientific community, to be engaging with stakeholders, all the stakeholders that are impacted when we're thinking about governance challenges. And so just finally, the good news is that the respondents in our survey wanted to know more, and they're interested in learning more about artificial intelligence. And I think that gives us an opportunity to do some public awareness and education pieces, which is something that I'm really interested in. And I think that applies not only to artificial intelligence, but also science, emerging science technologies like genomics, where there's also a real education gap between what the capability is and the public awareness. And I just put this up here to show, like, Finland's given us a really good example of how to encourage people to learn more. They've got this nationwide artificial intelligence program that's already launched. Here's a screenshot. And I think one of the great things here is that the public, the people that have signed up, 40% of them are female. So they're really going away to increase the diversity of people that have a baseline awareness about artificial intelligence. So I think that education is really key. I actually personally think that we should be doing much more teaching of ethics into our science and education programs. But I think it's really a bigger education piece that involves conversations and collaborations across disciplines and sectors, and including the public who are impacted by these technologies. And with that, I'll just say thanks. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion and talking about all this more.
Thank you, Caitlin. Really great to get the insights from that survey, and I think provide us a really good benchmark to go to the questions afterwards. I'd now like to pass it over to Justine to run through what you'd like to cover off in your time on this topic.
So, hi everyone, my name is Justine Lacey and I'm the Director of the Responsible Innovation Future Science Platform at the CSIRO. And, you know, I love discussions like the one that we're having today, and this is pretty much at the moment what I would call my life's work. And so I'm intrigued that we've gone from the utopian, future and the dystopian vision, and many conversations about technologies tend to start that way and end that way, and it doesn't matter if it's a digital technology or not. But coming from the science agency, I have, I guess, the great fortune to work across not just the digital sciences, but also the biological sciences and the physical sciences. And my particular specialty is the social sciences. And I think it's the convergence of those science areas that I really bring to the discussion today. And so I want to open with a few questions that are playing on my mind as I listen to this, because I'll be honest, when CEDA presented the opportunity, I thought public interest technology, sort of what an interesting concept that is. And I hadn't heard it phrased that way, because we often talk about responsible science and technology. So my first question would be, what is it exactly that we mean by public interest technology, and what do we expect it to do for us? And so I'm going to try and push into that space a little bit. How do we build capability around whatever it is that we define as public interest technology? And we're hearing a little bit now about training in some of the last few sessions and competence and things like that. And a final question, which is particularly close to my heart, and I've worked on a different concept, social license to operate, for many years, which is what role do community expectations play in the way we think about trust? And initially I was going to say trust in technology and/or trust in the technologists. But this morning we've heard about trust in governance, we've heard about trust in infrastructure, along with, who's making the technology, along with the technologists or the scientists themselves, along with, business and end users. And that framing of trust is moving around in the conversation quite a lot. So how are we actually tackling these issues at the CSIRO? So as Australia's national science agency, you should absolutely expect that what we're doing is using science and technology to develop innovative solutions to national challenges. So that's the kind of the big remit for us. But I want to speak to a very specific part of our portfolio, sort of in that broad remit, and that's our future science platforms. So we have a range of areas of research that do cut across the biological, the physical, the digital, and the social, that we have identified as areas that we do think have the potential to transform, to reinvent, and to create new industries in Australia. Now, there's currently 11 of these future science platforms in CSIRO, and they're diverse. You can be talking about synthetic biology and the changes that we expect in that area. We can be talking about advanced manufacturing and the changes that we're anticipating there. It can be about the complete transformation of our healthcare systems in this country. What will they look like in 20 years from now? And even our energy systems. So it's one thing to be purposefully disruptive, and we all want to move that disruption in a sort of a welcome direction. But we also recognise that we have a responsibility that goes with that. And since 2017, we've actually had a program of research, which is called Responsible Innovation. And I'm really happy that Hilary Sutcliffe mentioned it this morning and said that she'd been doing responsible innovation for businesses for 20 years, because it is a term that is much more familiar in Europe and to a degree, North America. So what does it mean? Well, for us, it is actually a program of research that we're developing to assess the risks, benefits, and uncertainties that are associated with different areas of future science and technology development. But for us, it will serve two important purposes if we get it right. So the first and higher order goal of responsible innovation for us is to ensure that responsible science and technology is designed and delivered for the benefit of all Australians. And that's a really big thing to say, right? But here's the moment where I say, well, what do we expect from responsible science and technology? What does it look like if public interest technology is in our life? Well, we've started to map it out. Success, in some cases, might look like delivering equitable access to personalised services to all Australians, or to some Australians who want those services. And these services might enhance their personal autonomy. They might reduce harms. And they might increase ability to manage things like your own personal health or wellbeing outcomes. Now, they're just examples, but I'm starting to try and push to what do we expect the lived reality of public interest technology to look like. Success might also be reflected in the fact that we can enhance the privacy and security of data that's not just genetic data, but other forms of personal data that belongs to Australians. And I would say the second and perhaps more immediate goal of responsible innovation is to develop the capabilities that will either catalyse the adoption of what we define as responsible science and technology. So who are the end users? What are the competencies that they require? And this is starting to speak into that broader and more connected technology governance arrangement that we've been hearing about. But importantly, I actually think it's not just the adopters or the users of technology. How do we also equip communities in this space? And so sometimes a community member will make a choiceful decision about the adoption of a technology or a platform or a service, but sometimes they won't. And I actually think that's important to recognise, but also how do we equip Australians to make, if they wish, the kinds of assessments that they need to about what trade-offs they might be entering into around some of these services and technologies. So that's my opening.
Thank you, Justine. I think that provides us a good basis to start. I should note that there is the opportunity to be asking questions within Pigeonhole. So I might start first with a question we've already got from the floor. This is from RD. Genomics was mentioned briefly in this session. Earlier, the notion of building rather than earning trust. What might the genomics research community have done better to build trust from the outset? Would anyone like to start with that?
Caitlin, do you want it? Or?
Sure. That's a good question. I think some of there are several trust issues. In population genomics, which is an area that I've looked at, I think some of the issues come from inequities in the databases. So what might happen as we're moving forward, and some of the concerns are that we're developing precision genomics tools that are suitable for some groups, particularly of European descent, while others are not really represented in the databases. And so the tools that we're developing aren't so equipped for those communities. I think the flip side of that, though, is also listening to the communities that are not in the databases as to their concerns, why they're hesitating to be in those databases, and being sure that their data is protected and private. I think those are some of the things that we could have done a bit better. I'm sure that Justine probably has some thoughts there as well.
Yeah, I'll give it a go because I wanted Caitlin to open because you actually have training in that area and I do not. I certainly think not just for genomics, as a kind of a broad area of application, but any technology or any industry or any kind of land use change. What we've seen, not only in Australia, but around the world is a real shift in societal expectation around having a say, being heard, having some influence on processes that perhaps, historically scientists didn't have as part of their considerations. And so even for, the development of science and technology, this is, we're not immune to it either. These are changes that we've seen probably since the 1960s in a really kind of structured way. And that's been part of the way we think about different issues. It depends how the question is framed. So we still do genomic science. There's an extraordinary amount of work that's underway in this domain still. And so whether it's, should they have done something different because there was a kind of a hope for a quicker uptake or a different outcome historically, that would be kind of, if I had the opportunity to ask the question back, that would be the question. Because Hillary did touch on this point this morning and she said, was it... a non-event, as one of the activists had put it to her about GMOs, or was it a great success that things had slowed down? And so even that matter of perspective on this framing of the question is actually quite important, I think.
Thank you. In the previous session, there's another question. That's coming through. Still writing. I'll go to one of mine. I'm interested in what role that you see, I guess, the research and science speaking directly and advocating for the public, and how do they get through those latter voices of both the sort of government and corporate interests? And just, again, this is like probably coming into more of that research translation piece, but just, I guess, with the foresight that you're seeing and Caitlin, to your point of looking at some of the research that you put forward earlier, like what advice do you have for those that are in the research community to be able to be I guess, like a pillar, an advocate pillar, as business or government might be within that space?
Yeah, well, I think that it's really, transparency is a really important first step, really being open and willing to communicate about what science is happening, and why it's happening, what are the benefits that it's going to bring, breaking it down and explaining it in a tangible way, and also acknowledging and having conversations about, risks and how they're going to be mitigated and managed, and to ensure that there are equitable and fair outcomes for people. I think one thing that came to light in our survey was that people, in the case of AI, people are more willing to trust in it when they feel like there are these assurance mechanisms in place. So things like ethics certifications or organizations that maybe are going to be adopting artificial intelligence, do they have internal processes in place? And, obviously not a tick and flick exercise where we're just meeting the minimum standard and checking the tick box, but are there genuine processes in place? And in the university context, which is the one where I live, we do have some of those, we have ethics boards, we have ethics committees that it's obviously not a perfect process, but there are processes in place where we have oversight over what we're doing along the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does the scientist speak directly? I would not want the scientist to speak for the public or advocate on behalf of the public. I think that would be problematic and quite paternal, and there's plenty of reasons that we go out and do big surveys to actually ask what people are thinking, so to make sure that we're getting an understanding of what we think is in the what the public thinks is in the public interest, not just what we think is in the public interest. But I will speak to a survey that we did with scientists and researchers in Australia last year, and we did it in 2019, and we were starting to try to pick apart what is responsible innovation and what do researchers and scientists think about it, and what do they think their own responsibilities are. And we were doing this for an event that was going to be hosted by the Australian Academy of Science. And there was a real kind of desire or a seeming recognition of a responsibility to be advancing what they described as a science-society relationship or dialogue, not necessarily feeling fully equipped to do that, but there was a few things that were driving it. The first one was they absolutely felt, as scientists and researchers in Australia, they had professional responsibility to understand that interface. So many of us aren't just doing research for its own sake. It is to address a problem, to do something in the world, to make the world a better place in some way, shape or form. They thought that improving that interface would actually contribute to social and national benefits. So the idea that you actually need to kind of know what's going on out there in the world to inform your science, to make it relevant, to make it fit for purpose. And to a much lesser extent, for them, it was partially driven by these kind of what we would see as like the current themes that we hear in many of these conversations. And by that, I mean that suddenly we're faced with disruptive technology, suddenly we're dealing with eroding trust in public and private institutions, and also we're working in an environment where there are a lot of threats to our environmental resources. And so that actually, I did think, was sort of felt very strongly in, scientists and researchers in this country.
Thank you. We've got another question from the floor. In the previous session, Matt argued that people who develop the tech should be responsible for it and its impact. Do you agree? I'm going to start with your response, Caitlin, because I know some of this might have been covered off in the survey that you showed earlier.
So I do think that that scientists and technologists should be responsible for the science and the technology that they're bringing into the world and releasing into the wild. But I don't think that they should be solely responsible. I think one of the points that I tried to bring up in that presentation was that sometimes their views may not be reflective of the wider views. So while I think there's a role for the scientists and the technologists, absolutely, I also think that they really need to be supported by people in culture where they work. Research institutions really need to be promoting a culture which is promoting, ethics and discussion and engagement with the community. And I also think that they need to be abiding by existing rights and laws and regulations, upholding, the human rights and non-discrimination and fitting within legal framework. I think that one of the other points was that, in some instances, many Australians feel that, the laws aren't quite sufficient right where they need to be for them to feel comfortable with the technology. So I think that, we all have a role to play, that it extends out beyond the technologists and scientists.
Okay, so I have read that bit of the Ethical by Design report, and I agree with what Caitlin has just said. Scientists and technologists have a professional responsibility around the work that they do, but what's very interesting in that report, and Matt could only present part of it, is he says, yes, technologists must be responsible. What the report goes on to say is the question is how much responsibility should they have? And so I think it's too simple to say technologists are just responsible for whatever they put out in the world, because it assumes that there's an incredible power in technologists just to shape whole systems, just to kind of, as they say, release it into the wild and have total control over that system. And I think the concern about unchecked, development of technology is a different thing. So, I mean, most of the kind of the downside risks that we look at will come out of it. Social media platforms are just fraught with these kinds of uses, and I don't work in that space, and so I work in a government agency where the way we develop technology is incredibly checked, and we are having these conversations, and social science embedded in your technology design is just normal practice, or it's becoming more normal practice for us, and so I think it's too simple to say it's just can be landed like that. But they ask the real work in Ethical by Design, which is to what extent, how much. And I think some of the questions about accountability are very interesting and also very hard problems in this domain.
You're mentioning there that government has quite a sort of structured process as opposed to what might happen, I guess, in the corporate sector. I'm interested, I guess, in where you've seen from your experience where, transposing, I guess, learnings and insights from research, academia and government, where have you seen, what do you see sort of those common themes or traits that businesses, for instance, should be looking and considering when they're going down this journey themselves?
Well, I've got another interesting insight there to share from our survey, which is that when it comes to corporate innovation with artificial intelligence, at least, people perceive that to be driven by financial motivations more than for societal good. So I think, really, again, explaining and genuinely developing technology that's for societal good and really communicating in a clear and transparent way why it's being developed, how it's being developed, and in the instance where there are issues, how does normally when there's an issue with science or technology that we're developing, it may be targeting vulnerable groups, and these people may be perhaps the least equipped financially and otherwise in terms of getting recourse. So really being transparent. Look, if you have an issue, this is where you can go and how you can resolve this issue. I think all of those things are really important.
It's interesting. It's like we're reflecting like a probably rightly so a degree of skepticism from business and to maybe down the line to government and maybe research about using some of these pieces. And it's interesting how that plays out. Justine, is there any more that you wanted to sort of
I would add, I think it's probably useful to have a discussion about the intersection of the public and the private interest as well, because I think we're just assuming the public interest will dominate everything. But we started to hear in the last session, I think, well, maybe with Ed and Matt, where could this be a differentiator? if I'm socially innovative in my technology, if I'm socially responsible in my technology and its governance, could this actually be part of my reputation or my brand differentiation in the market? And as much as that might now feel like I'm, muddying the waters and combining the two, I actually think we have to be much more explicit about that connection, because what are the incentives to do more and to be more? And if it starts in that place, I have kind of no issue with it. We do work with industry as a massive part of our business in the CSIRO. So I'm sort of thinking, I haven't been in the Silicon Valley where I'm moving fast and breaking things, so I don't know if that's mythology or if that's really how it goes. But I work in a structure where, science and technology is to be innovative. We are meant to be pushing the frontiers of that, but it's in response to national challenges. And so I have, a whole organisational structure wrapped around my work, and all of my colleagues do as well, that is highly driven by the public interest. But it's a public interest that's facing an Australian economy, an Australian environment, and Australian citizens.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. This conversation is curious. Let's take that as a compliment. I think it is. I feel like we are talking about data and laws of consequence, very much like we should have been talking about oil about 50 years ago. Would you agree?
Go ahead, Justine.
Okay, I'm happy to launch in. So yeah, hindsight, aren't we great? 2020 on everything after the fact. And so that's why I think so the way we're talking about digital technologies, my question is always, and I'm trained as an ethicist, is it the technology that creates a new and different ethical problem? Or, are we talking about, well, we're concerned about corporate behaviour, we're concerned about disadvantaging vulnerable populations? Have those things never existed before digitalisation? My argument would be no, they did exist. And so questions about have we thought carefully, about energy systems and the impact that they would have? Yes, we haven't anticipated them as perhaps we could have. And so my frustration sometimes working in this space is that I always hear the same argument. Oh, the technology is racing away, it's getting in front of us again. And I think, are we destined to always have that life, that we can never kind of cast forward? And so, as a scientist now working in this space, my work is really about how can we be better at this? So instead of lag indicators, which we're great at in science, how do we get to lead indicators? Now, does that mean being ethical means we'll anticipate everything, we'll never ever make a mistake again? No, of course it does not. But yeah, I don't always think that the problem presented is completely new to us, no matter what domain we're talking into.
Thank you. Caitlin, have you got views on this?
I do agree with the question that, it would have been great to be having these conversations, a while ago, but yeah, we're here. I do think that some of these conversations are happening in response to growing public expectation and people becoming more savvy around, particularly around their digital data. I know that one area that I've been sort of researching over the past few years is online DNA ancestry testing, and that's an area where they did actually even experience a slowdown in sales, that many CEOs gave interviews ascribing that to customers becoming more data savvy and concerned. And so in response, they sort of put out more clear statements on their websites. Whether that really resulted in changes in their privacy policies, I don't know. But I think that the consumers are also, with scandals, with Facebook Analytica and other scandals where people are starting to become a bit more attuned and aware of their own data. And with the GDPR in Europe, and our own sort of consultations around the Australian Privacy Act, I think these conversations are actually gaining a bit of momentum here in Australia as well, I hope.
Let's reflect. It was the oil crisis of 73, 74 that then led towards more mid-sized cars, the creation and, probably also the increase in Japanese car manufacturing, which had sort of knock-on effects to the US supremacy at the time. So the question for us is like, what type of data crisis would it be? Because you did bring up Facebook Analytica, which for those of us who've just gone through a recent US election, thankfully we didn't have that as a big issue, but it was the one before. So I guess there's sort of that broader piece. People seem from all of the sort of leading indicators using media as much, if not more, than they were 4 years ago. So I think it's maybe a broader theoretical question, but will there be a similar crisis now, in this coming decade that we might be to look at it? I mean, I just even reflect of how people use social media and the norms that, you had in 2006 and 2007 and the type of information that you'd provide in the realm of Facebook, and how, I guess, society has wised up. But I think to the point you were making too before, Justine, there's also leading indicators and lagging ones of how some of those things would be working. I've got a question for you both. This was in that part, in sort of one of the questions that was in the byline for this session. I'm interested in this more formalised public interest technology network. So you'd probably be aware in the US, there's schools at Harvard, MIT and Stanford that have been set up to sort of talk and research and debate, I guess, the role of technology in the role of, I guess, broader society. I was just interested whether you think Australia should follow suit towards a formalised process such as that. I take that as a nod, and this leads to my next question. If so, what do you think would be something, not so much different, but what are some considerations we'd have to give in an Australian context for something like this?
Okay, I'm happy to comment, Caitlin, but... Sure. Okay, so in terms of a formal network, yes, Australia may not have that now, but I would say that when we decided, in 2017 to say, what this country needs in terms of a focus on an area of science and technology, which we think is going to be important and disruptive in its own way, responsible innovation, we actually set up big collaborations with 3 Australian universities. And the reason for that is that we're not kind of trying to create a bespoke thing just for the National Science Agency, but a capability that sits in Charles Darwin University, in the University of Queensland, in the Australian National University. And the structure of those partnerships are actually around training the next generation of scientists and researchers that are going to be grappling with some of these questions about what are the ethics and the social and the legal implications of these areas of disruptive technology. And we try to make that applied and broad and actually thinking about it as a capability for the nation rather than just a singular institution. So I would not say that that's a formal kind of national network. It is just a very kind of grassroots. It's growing up slowly, but there definitely is activity like that, I think, in the research and innovation sector.
Caitlin?
I'd really like to see. I agree with that, and I'd really like to see more of these networks. I think there are many of us that would be on board for that. And as to how it would be different in Australia, I can't think of any reason that jumps out at me how that would be terribly different in Australia. I think that that there's a real appetite for something like that, and there would be support, and there are already many research groups working on really important areas of responsible innovation and ethical deployment of technologies and connecting them up. And also the flip side, when I read a bit about this program in the United States, the flip side in the New York Times article that I read about it was that they're also working hard with people who are already working in the fields of law and human rights to actually bring them into the fold and get them up to speed on the digital side of what they're already doing. So it seems like a really impactful thing that I'd love to be doing.
Right. Thank you. On that note, I'd like to thank both Caitlin and Justine for their time this afternoon, talking through this session from the technologist and science perspective. As we spoke at the outset, we did have a question. Do you believe that technologists are responsible for what they build? And lo and behold, 92.9% of us answered yes. No one was unsure, which is fantastic, which means that 7% said no. So I think that's probably consistent with some of the discussion that we've been having in this session. I think this is a really sort of good opportunity to be rounding out some of this discussion we're having here on day one of the Public Interest Technology Forum. And in terms of closing remarks, I'd now like to pass over to CEDA CEO, Melinda Salento to give her final remarks for the day. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Simon. What a fascinating, albeit curious, conversation to finish the morning or the slight early afternoon of day one of CEDA's inaugural Public Interest Technology Forum. I think, let me just pick up on one of the comments that Justine made in that last session. That I actually really agree with her in the sense that so many of the things that we're talking about are not new. But I think there's, of course, very different complexions to what we're grappling with rapidly emerging technologies and how they converge and intersect and interact with one another, sometimes in ways that people don't fully understand or appreciate at the initial stages. And I think I share the sentiment that was conveyed pretty clearly through that session, which is all about how can we get ahead of these conversations and how can we build some institutions and some networks and relationships that help us gain confidence that we're sort of alert to these issues and perhaps more so than we have been in the past. I started off the forum this morning by setting the scene in terms of talking about the importance of emerging technologies and how we make use of those and how important they'll be to Australia's future social and economic development. In that last session as well, we spoke about the sort of public and private intersection, and I just wanted to sort of reinforce that this isn't, a social versus economic argument, a public versus private sort of argument, but it's about understanding the conversations that we need to have as a society to ensure that we've got the right frameworks, that we understand well expectations, and that we are positively shaping Australia's future economic and social development in a way which, one, supports a dynamic economy, but two, also makes sure that people are right at the centre of that, and hence the sort of public interest framing. The ambition of this forum is nothing more than starting conversations. And wow, we've had some fantastic conversations already this morning. I think some really strong themes emerged across most of the different sessions. The importance of trust, but specifically trustworthiness and earning trust and what that means. The importance of listening, words like empathetic and being empathetic to understanding different people's perspectives, listening to them through an empathetic lens, if you like, and the importance of communicating and transparency. But communication in plain English, not in legalistic sense or a technologist or scientific sort of sense, but in a way that people who are wanting to engage can understand and effectively engage. Lots of conversation around co-creation. We had a very, very clear conversation around empowering consumers and what that meant and didn't mean. So an awful lot of content there to get through. I guess the question now is what next? Well, first cab off the rank in the what next is tomorrow's sessions, which will touch more on this sort of issue about what do we expect of different players in the technology space, all the way from the development, design and use. So we've heard from the technologists and scientists just then. Tomorrow we'll hear from, get the perspective of regulators and what the right regulatory settings mean. We'll get the perspective of business. And we'll try to reflect a little bit on what this rapid acceleration of digital take-up through COVID has meant when we think about the risks and reward and benefits and costs of the take-up of emerging technology. And then we'll close out with a sort of quick summary session with CEDA's own Public Interest Technology Advisory Committee. So another full day. So that's step one in what next. Step two is that we're going to work our way through all of the conversations today and feedback from you, the audience, and look at what we think are the next important areas of work to pursue where we might gain some traction. That might be on looking to work with our university partners and members to set up a network, as was just discussed in that session. Some interesting things that came out of the consumer empowerment session. So we'll unpack all of that and look at ways in which we think we can push this really important conversation further in the national policy space and more broadly. So that's it from me today. I hope to catch you tomorrow as well. Let me just close by thanking the members of our advisory committee, including Portable, Newgate, Gilbert and Tobin, the University of Queensland Queensland University of Technology, University of Sydney Technology, and of course our foundation partners, KPMG, IBM and Google. So thank you again for participating today. I hope you can join us tomorrow, and thank you especially to all of our wonderful speakers and presenters. With that, good afternoon.